Margaret stared at the glossy vacation photos scattered across her kitchen table. Her son Michael had just left, and the smell of his cologne still lingered in the air. The Bahamas looked stunning in those pictures. Crystal blue water, white sand beaches, palm trees swaying in the breeze. But what struck her most wasn't the beauty of the destination. It was the complete absence of any mention of her joining them. This was the 5th time. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. At 67, Margaret had learned to recognize the pattern. First, there was the excited announcement about the upcoming family trip. Then came the glossy brochures, the detailed itinerary, the enthusiastic descriptions of all the fun they would have. And finally, when she would naturally ask about her own participation, came the excuses. The first trip had been to Florida 3 years ago. "Mom, there's just not enough room in the car," Michael had explained, his face apologetic but firm. "You know how cramped it gets with all of Emma's baby gear and Tommy's car seat." Margaret had understood then. Tommy was only 2, and traveling with a toddler required so much equipment. The second trip was to California last year. "The hotel made a mistake with our reservation," Emma had said over the phone, her voice strained. "They only have one room available, and it barely fits the 3 of us. We tried calling other places, but everything's booked solid." Margaret had accepted this explanation too. These things happened, especially during peak tourist season. The third trip was to Colorado for a skiing vacation 6 months ago. "Mom, you know how your knees have been bothering you," Michael had said gently. "All that walking in the snow, the altitude changes. I just don't think it would be comfortable for you." That one had stung more than the others. Margaret's knees were fine. She walked 3 miles every morning around her neighborhood, and had never complained about any discomfort. The fourth trip was to New York City just 2 months ago. For this one, they hadn't even bothered with an excuse. Michael had simply shown her the photos after they returned him, Emma, and 5-year-old Tommy standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, grinning widely. "We decided to make it a quick weekend getaway," he had said casually. "Very last minute. Didn't want to bother you with all the rushed planning. And now this. The Bahamas. A full week in paradise, and once again she wasn't invited." Margaret picked up one of the photos, Michael and Emma walking hand in hand along the beach while Tommy built a sandcastle nearby. They looked like the perfect family. Happy, carefree, complete. Complete without her. She thought about all the years she had spent raising Michael alone after his father died. The double shifts she had worked at the diner to pay for his college tuition. The way she had sold her childhood home, the house where she had planned to grow old, to help him make the down payment on his current house. She had given him her entire life savings, nearly $40,000, to ensure his family would have a good start. When Emma was pregnant with Tommy, Margaret had quit her part-time job at the local library to help care for her daughter-in-law. She had cooked meals, cleaned house, and held Emma's hand through morning sickness and doctor's appointments. When Tommy was born, Margaret had practically moved in for the first 3 months, taking night feedings so the new parents could sleep. She had been there for every milestone. Tommy's first steps were in her living room. His first word was Gamma, his attempt at saying grandma. She had potty trained him, taught him to tie his shoes, and read him bedtime stories every night when Michael and Emma worked late. But apparently, none of that earned her a place on their family vacations. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma with more photos from their trip. The message read, "Tommy keeps asking about you. He says the beach would be more fun if Grandma was here to help him find shells." The irony wasn't lost on her. Tommy wanted her there, but his parents had decided she didn't belong. Margaret set down her phone and walked to her bedroom. In the back of her closet, behind her winter coats, was a small metal box where she kept her most important papers. She pulled out her bank statements and spread them on her bed. Her monthly Social Security check was $1,800. After rent, utilities, groceries, and medications, she usually had about $200 left over each month. She had been saving that money religiously, thinking Michael might need help again someday. The savings account balance showed $3,200. For 5 years, she had lived frugally, denying herself small pleasures, always thinking about her family's needs first. She bought generic groceries, shopped at thrift stores, and hadn't taken a real vacation since before her husband died 15 years ago. Every dollar had been saved with the idea that it might help Michael and Emma somehow. But sitting there on her bed, surrounded by bank statements and looking at photos of a family vacation she wasn't invited to, something shifted inside Margaret. A quiet anger began to build. Not the explosive kind, but the slow-burning type that comes from years of accumulated disappointment. She had spent her entire adult life putting other people first. Her husband's career had come before hers. Michael's education had taken priority over her own dreams. His family's financial security had mattered more than her comfort. When was the last time she had done something purely for herself? Margaret couldn't remember. The next morning, she walked downtown to Sunrise Travel Agency. The office was small and cheerful, with posters of exotic destinations covering every wall. A young woman named Jessica greeted her with a bright smile. "I'd like to take a trip," Margaret said simply. "Wonderful. Are you thinking domestic or international? Beach or mountains? All-inclusive or more of an adventure tour?" Margaret looked at the wall of posters. Her eyes landed on one showing ancient pyramids against a sunset sky. "Egypt," she said. "I want to see the pyramids." Jessica's eyes lit up. "Oh, Egypt is amazing. We have a fantastic 2-week cultural tour that's perfect for mature travelers. It includes Cairo, Luxor, Aswan, a Nile cruise, and even a day in the desert. The group is small, the guide is excellent, and everything is included." "How much?" "For the deluxe package, it's $2,800. That covers flights, hotels, all meals, guided tours, entrance fees, and transportation." Margaret thought about her savings account. This would use most of her carefully hoarded money. The practical part of her brain protested. This was reckless, irresponsible, selfish. But another part, a part that had been silent for too long, whispered that she deserved this. "I'll take it," she said. Jessica spent the next hour going over details, travel insurance, packing suggestions, required vaccinations. Margaret signed papers and handed over her credit card with hands that only trembled slightly. When it was done, she had a thick folder of information and a departure date just 3 weeks away. Walking home, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not the anxious kind that came with worrying about other people's problems, but the excited kind that came with looking forward to something wonderful. That evening, Michael called as he usually did after returning from a trip. "Hi Mom, we're back. The Bahamas were incredible. Tommy had such a great time." "That's nice, dear. I saw the photos Emma sent." "Yeah, she takes great pictures. Listen, we brought you something. Can I come by tomorrow evening?" "Actually, I have plans tomorrow evening." There was a pause. Margaret rarely had plans that didn't involve her family. "Oh, okay. How about Wednesday?" "Wednesday works." When Michael arrived on Wednesday, he was carrying a small gift bag and wearing the slightly guilty expression he always had after returning from a trip without her. He kissed her cheek and handed her the bag. "We got you some local honey and a beautiful scarf," he said. The woman at the market said the scarf was handmade by local artisans. Margaret pulled out a turquoise scarf with tiny seashells sewn along the edges. It was lovely and clearly expensive. She also noticed it was the kind of consolation gift someone bought to assuage their conscience. "Thank you. It's beautiful. So what were you up to while we were gone? You said you had plans yesterday." "I've been busy planning my own trip, actually." Michael looked surprised. "A trip? Where are you going?" "Egypt. 2 weeks. I leave next Friday." The surprise on Michael's face quickly turned to concern. "Egypt? Mom, that's really far. And isn't it kind of dangerous right now?" "It's a guided tour with a reputable company. Perfectly safe. But the flights are so long, and the food will be completely different, and the climate." Michael sat down heavily on her couch. "Mom, I don't think this is a good idea." Margaret felt the familiar surge of frustration. When Michael's family traveled to exotic locations, it was an adventure. When she wanted to do the same thing, it was dangerous and inadvisable. "I'm not asking for your permission, Michael. I'm telling you what I'm doing." "But what if something happens? What if you get sick? What if there's a problem with your medications? You'll be thousands of miles away from your doctors, from people who know you. People travel to Egypt safely every day." "I'll be fine." Michael ran his hands through his hair, clearly agitated. How much is this costing you? That's not your concern. Of course it's my concern. Mom, you're not exactly swimming in money. If you wanted to take a trip, we could have planned something closer to home. Maybe a nice weekend in the mountains, or a week at the beach in North Carolina. Margaret looked at her son, this man she had raised and sacrificed everything for, and felt a profound sadness. He couldn't even conceive of her as an independent person capable of making her own choices. Michael, she said quietly, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted to do? What do you mean? I mean, when was the last time you called and said, Mom, we're planning a vacation. Where would you like to go? Or Mom, what's something you've always wanted to see? Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again. You don't ask because you don't think about what I might want. You think about what's convenient for you, what fits into your family's plans, what won't disrupt your routine. And apparently, I don't fit into any of those categories. That's not true, isn't it? 5 trips, Michael. 5 family vacations, and I wasn't invited to a single one. Those trips weren't really suitable for. For what? For someone my age? For someone with my limited interests? For someone who might slow you down or cramp your style? Michael looked genuinely distressed now. Mom, that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He struggled for words, and Margaret realized he had never actually thought about it from her perspective. In his mind, she was simply part of the background of his life, always there, always available, always understanding. It had never occurred to him that she might want something different. I leave Friday morning, Margaret said, standing up. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Tommy can call me on my cell phone if he wants to talk. Michael left that night looking confused and worried. Margaret didn't care. For the first time in years, she was putting herself first, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, she went shopping for travel clothes and a new suitcase. At the outdoor gear store, the teenage clerk looked impressed when Margaret mentioned she was going to Egypt. Solo travel? That's so cool. My mom would never have the guts to do something like that. Margaret smiled. Well, I'm discovering I have more guts than I thought. As she walked home with her purchases, Margaret felt like she was shedding an old skin. The woman who always said yes, who always accommodated, who always put everyone else's needs first, that woman was staying home. The woman getting on the plane to Egypt was someone new. Someone who mattered. The plane touched down in Cairo at sunset, and Margaret pressed her face to the small window, watching the sprawling city emerge from the golden haze. The pyramids were visible in the distance, dark triangular shapes against the orange sky, and she felt her heart skip with excitement. She was actually here. She had actually done it. At the airport, she found her tour group easily enough. 18 people clustered around a man holding a sign that read, Desert Dreams Egypt Tours. Their guide introduced himself as Amari, a cheerful Egyptian man in his 40s who spoke English with a musical accent that made even the most mundane instructions sound exotic. Welcome to Egypt, my friends, he said, beaming at the group. For the next 14 days, you will see wonders that have stood for thousands of years. You will cruise the Nile like ancient pharaohs, walk where Moses walked, and sleep under stars that have watched over this land since the beginning of time. Margaret looked around at her fellow travelers. Most were couples in their 50s and 60s, with a few solo travelers like herself scattered throughout. There was a retired teacher from Oregon named Betty, a widowed professor from Michigan called Frank, and a divorced accountant from Texas who went by Sue. Within an hour of boarding their bus, Margaret felt more at ease than she had in months. The hotel in Cairo was modest but clean, with a view of the city from her third-floor window. Margaret had never stayed in a hotel room by herself. Even during her marriage, she and Robert had rarely traveled. She unpacked her new clothes and hung them carefully in the wardrobe, feeling proud of her practical purchases. The hiking boots felt sturdy on her feet, and the lightweight pants were comfortable in the warm climate. That first evening, the group gathered for dinner in the hotel restaurant. Margaret found herself seated between Frank and Betty, both of whom were seasoned travelers with fascinating stories. Frank had been to over 30 countries since his wife died 5 years earlier. The secret, he told Margaret over grilled fish and rice, is to stop waiting for the perfect time or the perfect companion. The perfect time is now, and the perfect companion is yourself. Betty nodded enthusiastically. I spent 40 years married to a man who hated to travel. When he passed, I promised myself I'd see everything I'd always dreamed of. This is my 8th international trip in 3 years. Margaret felt a flutter of recognition. These people understood something that Michael didn't, that life was meant to be lived, not just endured. The next morning, they visited the Giza Pyramid Complex. Standing at the base of the Great Pyramid, Margaret had to crane her neck to see the top. The massive limestone blocks rose impossibly high, each one larger than her entire apartment. She reached out and touched the ancient stone, wondering about the hands that had placed it there over 4,000 years ago. "Amazing, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. Margaret turned to see a man about her age with kind eyes and silver hair. "I'm Walter from Denver. Been wanting to see these since I was 10 years old." "Margaret from North Carolina. Same here, always dreamed of this." They walked together through the complex, marveling at the Sphinx with its enigmatic smile, and the smaller pyramids that surrounded the great ones. Walter was a retired engineer, and he explained some of the construction techniques that made these monuments possible. Margaret found his knowledge fascinating and his company comfortable. That afternoon they visited the Egyptian Museum. Margaret stood before golden treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, jewelry that had adorned pharaohs, and papyrus scrolls covered in hieroglyphics. Each artifact told a story of people who had lived and loved and dreamed thousands of years ago, yet whose creations still inspired wonder today. At dinner, she sat with Walter and discovered they had much in common. He had also lost his spouse. His wife Sarah had died of cancer 2 years earlier. Like Margaret, he had adult children who worried about his traveling alone but didn't quite understand his need for adventure. "My daughter thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown," Walter laughed. "She keeps suggesting I take up golf or join a book club instead of gallivanting around the world." Margaret smiled. "My son thinks I'm being reckless and irresponsible. He actually tried to talk me out of coming. And yet here we are. Here we are." The next few days blurred together in a kaleidoscope of experiences. They flew to Luxor and visited the Valley of the Kings, walking through tombs carved deep into the rock, their walls covered in vibrant paintings that still glowed with color after millennia. Margaret stood in Tutankhamun's actual burial chamber, breathing the same air that had been sealed away for thousands of years. At Karnak Temple, she wandered among columns so massive that 20 people holding hands couldn't encircle one of them. The scale was overwhelming, humbling, and deeply moving. She took dozens of photos, not just of the monuments but of herself in front of them, proof that she had been here, had seen these wonders with her own eyes. The Nile cruise was perhaps the most magical part of the journey. Their boat was small and comfortable, with a deck where passengers could sit and watch the timeless scenes along the riverbank. Farmers worked their fields with methods unchanged for centuries. Children waved from mud brick villages, and feluccas with white sails glided past like ghosts from another era. Margaret spent hours on deck, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the world drift by. Walter often joined her, and they fell into easy conversations about everything and nothing. He told her about his career designing bridges, about his wife's battle with illness, about his children and grandchildren scattered across the country. Margaret found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone in years, about her dreams of becoming a teacher before she married, about the novel she had started writing but never finished, about the loneliness she felt even when surrounded by family. "You know what I realized on my first trip after Sarah died?" Walter said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the Nile gold. "I had become so focused on being a husband, a father, a provider that I had forgotten how to just be myself. It took traveling alone to remember who Walter actually was, underneath all those roles." Margaret nodded, understanding completely. She had been a wife, then a mother, then a grandmother, but when was the last time she had simply been Margaret? Their fellow travelers became like a small family. Sue from Texas was hilarious, with an endless supply of jokes and stories that kept everyone laughing. Betty was endlessly curious, asking their guide detailed questions about everything from ancient burial practices to modern Egyptian politics. Frank was the group's unofficial photographer, always ready to take pictures of couples or friends in front of monuments. At Aswan, they visited a Nubian village and were invited into local homes for tea. Margaret sat cross-legged on colorful rugs, sipping sweet mint tea and communicating through smiles and gestures with women who spoke no English, but whose warmth transcended language barriers. The children were fascinated by her gray hair and lined face, touching her hands gently and giggling when she made faces at them. That evening, Margaret called Tommy on her cell phone. Her grandson's face lit up when he saw her on the video call. "Grandma, where are you now?" "I'm on a boat sailing down the Nile River, sweetheart. It's the same river where Moses was found as a baby, and where Cleopatra sailed with Mark Antony." Tommy's eyes widened. "Can you see crocodiles?" "I haven't seen any yet, but our guide says they're here somewhere." "Are you having fun?" "I'm having the most wonderful time, Tommy. I'm learning so much and seeing things I never imagined I'd see." She could see Michael and Emma in the background, but they didn't join the conversation. Tommy chattered about school and his friends for a few more minutes before Emma called him for dinner. After he hung up, Margaret felt a pang of longing, not for home exactly, but for her grandson's unconditional love and acceptance. The next day brought one of the most challenging but rewarding experiences of the trip, a visit to Abu Simbel. They woke before dawn and took a bus convoy across the desert, watching the sun rise over endless sand dunes. The temple, when it finally appeared, was breathtaking. Four massive statues of Ramesses II sat guard at the entrance, each one 65 feet tall, their faces serene and eternal. Inside the temple, Margaret learned about the incredible engineering feat that had saved it from flooding when the Aswan Dam was built. The entire complex had been cut into blocks and moved to higher ground, piece by piece, in one of the most ambitious archaeological projects in history. "If they could move an entire temple to save it," Walter commented, "I suppose we can move ourselves to save ourselves." Margaret understood what he meant. Sometimes survival required dramatic action, even when it seemed impossible or frightening. From Aswan, they flew back to Cairo for the final portion of their journey. Margaret had grown comfortable with the group dynamics, with the rhythm of early mornings and long days of sightseeing, with the simple pleasure of eating meals she hadn't cooked and sleeping in beds she didn't have to make. On their last full day, they visited the Citadel and the Blue Mosque, then spent the afternoon in Khan el-Khalili Bazaar. Margaret bought gifts for Tommy: a small camel made of carved wood, a t-shirt with pyramids on it, and a book about ancient Egypt with lots of pictures. For Michael and Emma, she selected beautiful scarves and some Egyptian cotton towels. For herself, she bought a silver bracelet engraved with hieroglyphics and a small papyrus painting of the goddess Isis. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with kind eyes, told her that Isis was the goddess of motherhood and magic, but also of independence and strength. "She is perfect for you," he said with a smile. "A woman who travels alone has the spirit of Isis." That evening, the group gathered for their farewell dinner. Amari presented each traveler with a certificate of completion and a small gift, a bookmark made of papyrus with their name written in hieroglyphics. Margaret looked around the table at these people who had become friends, who had shared this incredible journey with her, and felt a deep gratitude. "2 weeks ago, I was just someone's mother and grandmother," she said when Amari asked if anyone wanted to share their thoughts about the trip. "I was living my entire life in service to other people's dreams and plans. But this trip has reminded me that I'm also Margaret, that I have my own dreams and my own right to pursue them." The group applauded, and several people nodded in understanding. Betty reached over and squeezed her hand. "The hardest part," Betty said, "is going home and maintaining this feeling. The world will try to put you back in your old box, but you don't have to climb into it." That night, Margaret lay in her hotel bed looking through the hundreds of photos on her phone. There she was, standing in front of the pyramids with the biggest smile on her face. There she was, laughing with Walter on the deck of the Nile cruise ship. There she was, wearing a colorful headscarf in the Nubian village, surrounded by children. In every photo, she looked alive in a way she hadn't for years. Her eyes were bright, her posture confident, her smile genuine. This was who she really was, underneath all the worry and self-sacrifice in living for others. This was Margaret. The flight home seemed both too long and too short. Margaret wasn't ready to leave this new version of herself behind, but she was also curious about how this experience would change her relationships with her family. She had proven something to herself over these 2 weeks, that she was capable, adventurous, and worthy of respect. The question now was whether Michael and Emma would see it too. As the plane descended toward the familiar landscape of North Carolina, Margaret touched the silver bracelet on her wrist and made a silent promise. She would not allow herself to disappear again. The woman who had climbed to the top of the Great Pyramid and sailed the Nile and made friends with people from around the world, that woman was going home too, and she was there to stay. Walter, who was catching a connecting flight to Denver, squeezed her hand as they said goodbye in the airport. "Remember," he said, "you're not the same person who left 2 weeks ago. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Margaret nodded, shouldering her travel bag with confidence. She wasn't the same person. She was better. Michael was waiting at the baggage claim when Margaret emerged from the gate, looking tanned and remarkably energetic for someone who had just endured a 14-hour flight. Behind him stood Emma, holding a sleepy Tommy who perked up the moment he spotted his grandmother. "Grandma!" Tommy wriggled out of his mother's arms and ran toward Margaret, wrapping himself around her legs. "You're back. Did you see mummies? Did you ride a camel?" Margaret laughed, the sound richer and more carefree than Michael remembered hearing in years. She knelt down to Tommy's level, her eyes sparkling with genuine excitement. "I saw the most amazing things, sweetheart. Real pyramids bigger than houses and boats on the Nile River, and yes, I did ride a camel. I have pictures to show you and presents too." Michael watched this interaction with a mixture of relief and unease. His mother looked different. There was a confidence in her posture, a brightness in her voice that he wasn't accustomed to. During their brief phone calls while she was away, she had sounded happy but distant, as if she was speaking from another world entirely. The drive home was filled with Tommy's endless questions about Egypt and Margaret's animated responses. She told him about the teenage boy at the bazaar who could speak 5 languages, about the hotel cat who had adopted their tour group, about the sunrise over the desert that painted everything gold and pink. Michael found himself listening despite his lingering disapproval of the trip, surprised by his mother's storytelling ability and the obvious joy in her voice. At Margaret's apartment, she insisted on unpacking her gifts immediately. For Tommy, there was the wooden camel, a t-shirt with hieroglyphics, and a children's book about Egyptian mythology. The little boy was enchanted, immediately naming the camel Humpy, and demanding that Margaret read him the book right away. For Emma, she produced a beautiful turquoise scarf shot through with gold threads, and a set of jasmine-scented soaps wrapped in Arabic script. Emma seemed genuinely touched, examining the intricate patterns of the scarf with appreciation. "This is gorgeous, Margaret. You really shouldn't have spent so much on us." "It wasn't much," Margaret replied, though Michael noted the casual way she said it, as if money was no longer a constant worry. "I enjoyed picking things out for you." For Michael, there was a leather journal embossed with Egyptian motifs, and a small bronze replica of an ancient compass. The gifts were thoughtful, more personal than the generic souvenirs he had expected. "Thanks, Mom. These are really nice." He flipped through the blank pages of the journal, wondering when he would ever have time to write in it. "So tell us about the trip. Was it everything you hoped?" For the next hour, Margaret regaled them with stories. She showed them photos on her phone, herself standing dwarfed by massive temple columns, laughing with her tour group at dinner, wearing a colorful headscarf while riding a felucca boat. In every picture, she looked radiantly happy. "Who's that?" Emma asked, pointing to a photo of Margaret sitting beside a distinguished-looking man with silver hair. "That's Walter. He's from Denver, a retired engineer. We became good friends during the trip." Michael felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy. His mother had made a friend, someone who shared her enthusiasm for travel and adventure, someone who had gotten to see this vibrant version of her that Michael barely recognized. "The group was wonderful," Margaret continued. "Betty has been to 8 countries since her husband died. Frank has visited over 30. And Sue, she's planning to bike through Vietnam next year at age 64. The casual way his mother mentioned these people and their adventurous plans made Michael uncomfortable. These weren't the kind of sensible, safe activities he associated with people their age. They sounded reckless, irresponsible, exactly the kind of influence he had worried about when his mother announced her Egypt plans. After Emma and Tommy left that evening, Michael lingered. Something was nagging at him about his mother's transformation, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" "Of course, dear." Margaret was still unpacking, carefully arranging her new purchases on her bookshelf. "I'm glad you had a good time, I really am. But I have to ask, How much did all this cost you? Margaret paused in her unpacking. Why do you want to know? Because I worry about you. You're living on a fixed income, and that Egypt trip couldn't have been cheap. I just want to make sure you're not putting yourself in a difficult financial position. I'm fine, Michael. But the flight alone must have been over $1,000, and then hotels, food, tours. Michael. Margaret's voice carried a warning tone he wasn't used to hearing. I'm a grown woman. I can manage my own finances. I know, but you've always been so careful with money. Remember when you wouldn't even buy yourself a new winter coat because you were saving for Tommy's college fund? And now you're spending thousands on vacation. Margaret set down the bronze compass she had been examining and looked at her son directly. Maybe I was too careful before. Maybe I spent too many years denying myself things I wanted because I thought other people's needs were more important. The conversation was interrupted by Michael's phone ringing. It was Emma, and from her tone something was wrong. Michael, can you come home? There's something we need to discuss, and I'd rather do it in person. 20 minutes later, Michael was sitting at his kitchen table, while Emma paced nervously around the room. Tommy had been put to bed, and the house felt unnaturally quiet. What's going on? Michael asked. Emma stopped pacing and faced him. I got a call today. From your office. Michael's stomach dropped. What kind of call? They were looking for you. Apparently, you missed a meeting this morning, and when they couldn't reach you on your cell phone, they tried the house number. Michael had turned off his phone during the conversation with his mother, not wanting any interruptions during what he expected to be a difficult discussion about her spending. I explained that you were picking up your mother from the airport, Emma continued. And then Janet from HR asked to speak with me privately. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. Janet was the HR director, and there was only one reason she would want to speak with Emma privately. She told me about the layoffs. About your position being eliminated. Michael, why didn't you tell me? The words hung in the air between them. Michael had been dreading this conversation for 3 weeks, ever since he received the official notice. He had convinced himself that he would find another job quickly, that Emma would never need to know about the brief period of unemployment. I didn't want you to worry. I thought I'd have something else lined up by now. When did this happen? 3 weeks ago. Right after we got back from the Bahamas. Emma stared at him. 3 weeks? Michael, we've been making plans, spending money, living like everything was normal, and you've been unemployed for 3 weeks. I've been looking for work every day. I have applications out with 6 different companies. I just thought. You thought what? That you could hide this from me indefinitely. Michael rubbed his hands over his face. The Bahamas trip had cost them nearly $8,000. Money they had charged to credit cards, assuming his steady paycheck would cover the payments. Now those bills were coming due along with the mortgage, car payments, and all their other monthly expenses. How long can we manage without your salary? Emma asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Maybe 2 months if we're really careful. 3 if we cut everything non-essential. And after that? Michael didn't answer. After that, they would have to start making impossible choices, which bills to pay, which necessities to sacrifice. The house they had worked so hard to buy, the life they had built, all of it was suddenly precarious. Emma sank into a chair across from him. We should have canceled the Bahamas trip when you knew this was coming. The trip was non-refundable, and I really thought I'd have another job by now. The market is just tighter than I expected. They sat in silence for several minutes, both contemplating the enormity of their situation. Finally, Emma spoke. We're going to have to ask for help. Michael knew she was right, but the thought made him feel sick. He was 35 years old, a college graduate with over a decade of work experience. Asking for help felt like admitting failure, like acknowledging that he couldn't take care of his own family. Maybe we could borrow against the house. Michael, we barely have any equity, and with your employment situation, no bank is going to give us a loan. They both knew there was only one realistic option. Margaret had always been their safety net, the person who stepped in when times got tough. She had helped with the down payment on their house, contributed to their wedding expenses, and sent money for Tommy's preschool tuition more than once. She just spent thousands of dollars on that Egypt trip, Michael said. I don't even know if she has anything left to lend us. We won't know until we ask. The next morning, Michael called his mother and asked if he could come over. He had barely slept, rehearsing different ways to approach the conversation. How do you ask someone for money? How do you admit that your carefully constructed adult life is falling apart? Margaret was in her kitchen when he arrived, sorting through photos from her trip. She looked up with a smile when he knocked, but her expression grew concerned when she saw his face. Michael, what's wrong? He sat down across from her, suddenly feeling like a child again. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need to ask for your help. Margaret set down the photos and gave him her full attention. I lost my job 3 weeks ago. The company had layoffs, and my position was eliminated. Margaret's face showed no surprise, which confused him. I've been looking for work, but nothing has come through yet. With the mortgage and all our other expenses. He paused, gathering courage. We're going to run out of money soon. I was wondering if you might be able to help us out, just temporarily, until I get back on my feet. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. How much do you need? Maybe $5,000? Just to get us through the next few months. I'll pay you back as soon as I'm working again, I promise. When exactly did you lose your job? 3 weeks ago. Right after the Bahamas. Margaret's expression shifted, and Michael saw something in her eyes that he didn't recognize. Disappointment mixed with something harder. So you knew you were unemployed when you came back from your $8,000 vacation? Michael winced. It was non-refundable, and I thought. And you knew you were unemployed when you sat in this kitchen and lectured me about being financially irresponsible? The truth of it hit Michael like a physical blow. While he was criticizing his mother for spending her own money on a trip that brought her joy, he had been hiding a financial crisis that made her Egypt vacation look modest by comparison. I was trying to protect you from worrying. You were trying to protect yourself from being judged. Margaret's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Just like you've been protecting yourself from having to include me in your family's plans all these years. Mom, that's not fair. Isn't it? You spent $8,000 on a family vacation while knowing your job was in jeopardy, but you couldn't spare $800 to include me. You hid your unemployment while criticizing my financial choices. And now that you need money, suddenly you remember that I exist. Michael felt heat rising in his cheeks. I've never forgotten you exist. Haven't you? When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you asked about my interests, my dreams, my plans that didn't involve serving your family's needs? The questions hung in the air unanswered because Michael couldn't think of a single example. Every conversation they had revolved around his family, his problems, his needs. I'll lend you the money, Margaret said finally. But we're going to do this properly. You'll sign a promissory note, and you'll pay me back with interest. And there are going to be some changes in how our family operates. Michael nodded, feeling both relieved and ashamed. Whatever you think is fair. From now on, I expect to be included in family decisions that affect me. Not as an afterthought, not as a convenience, but as a member of this family who deserves respect and consideration. Of course. And the next time you plan a family vacation, you'll ask me if I want to come before you make reservations. If I say yes, you'll include me. If I say no, that's my choice. But you'll ask. Absolutely. Margaret stood up and walked to her desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. I'll draw up a loan agreement. $5,000 to be repaid within 6 months, with 3% interest. As she wrote, Michael realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. His mother was no longer the person who automatically said yes to his requests, who absorbed his problems without question, who existed primarily to serve his family's needs. She was someone else now. Someone who had ridden camels in the desert and made friends with strangers and proven she could navigate the world on her own terms. Someone who expected to be treated with respect. The change should have felt threatening, but instead, Michael found himself feeling something unexpected. Pride. His mother had become a person he genuinely admired, and it had taken her traveling halfway around the world for him to see it. Margaret handed Michael the signed loan agreement 3 days later, along with a check for $5,000. His relief was palpable, but she noticed something else in his expression, a new kind of respect that hadn't been there before their difficult conversation. Thank you, Mom. I know I haven't been the son you deserved, but I'm going to do better. Actions speak louder than words, Michael. Show me, don't tell me. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to see small changes. Michael called more frequently, and not just when he needed something. Emma started inviting her for dinner on Sundays, making an effort to cook foods Margaret enjoyed rather than just assuming she would be grateful for whatever was served. Tommy, oblivious to the adult tensions that had been resolved, simply enjoyed having his grandmother around more often. But Margaret also maintained the independence she had discovered in Egypt. She joined a travel club at the local community center, where she met other adventurous seniors planning trips to places like Peru and Iceland. She signed up for Arabic language classes at the library, wanting to better understand the culture she had briefly experienced. She even started writing again, working on short stories inspired by her travels. Walter called her twice from Denver, sharing photos from his latest trip to Morocco and encouraging her travel plans. Their friendship had continued beyond Egypt, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared enthusiasm for life's possibilities. "You sound different," he told her during one of their phone conversations. "More confident. More like yourself." "I feel like myself," Margaret replied, for the first time in years. 6 weeks after returning from Egypt, Margaret received the call she had been dreading. Michael's voice was tight with stress when she answered. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" When he arrived, she could see the weight of worry in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes. The job search wasn't going as well as he had hoped, and their financial situation was becoming more desperate. "I found a position," he said without preamble. "It's not ideal, the pay is 20% less than my old job, and it's a 40-minute commute each way. But it's steady work with benefits." "That's wonderful news. When do you start?" "Next Monday." "But Mom, there's something else. We're really struggling. Even with this new job, we're barely going to make ends meet. The credit card bills from the Bahamas mortgage, everything." He took a shaky breath. "I was wondering if you might consider lending us another $3,000, just to get caught up on everything." Margaret studied her son's face. The pride that had once prevented him from asking for help had been worn away by necessity, but she could see this wasn't easy for him. More importantly, she could see that he was being honest with her now, not trying to hide or minimize their problems. "What's your plan for paying me back?" "I've worked it all out. With the new salary, if we stick to a strict budget, I can pay you back the full $8,000 over the next 8 months. I know that's longer than the original agreement, but—" Michael, stop. Margaret held up her hand. "I'll lend you the additional money, but I want to modify our arrangement." Relief flooded his face. "Whatever you think is fair. 6 months from now, when your finances are more stable, I want to take another trip. A longer one this time, maybe 3 weeks in Asia. And I want you and Emma to support that decision without lectures about safety or expense." "Of course. Absolutely. And this summer I want us to plan a real family vacation together. Not something you plan and then reluctantly include me in, but something we design together, taking everyone's interests into account." Michael nodded eagerly. "Where would you like to go?" Margaret smiled. "I've always wanted to see the Northern Lights. Maybe Alaska or Iceland." "That sounds amazing. Tommy would love it." 2 months later, Michael made his first loan payment. Right on schedule, just as he had promised. With it came a handwritten note. "Thank you for believing in us and for teaching me what real family support looks like." But the real test came in April, when Michael called with excitement in his voice instead of stress. "Mom, I have incredible news. Remember that company I interviewed with 3 weeks ago? They called today with an offer. It's actually more money than my old job, and the benefits are fantastic." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of how hard you've worked." "There's more. They want me to start in 2 weeks, which means I can pay you back the full loan amount early. But I was thinking, instead of just paying you back, what if we used that money to plan an amazing family trip together? Emma found this cruise that goes to Norway to see the Northern Lights, and there are stops in Iceland and Greenland too." Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction. This was what she had hoped for. Not just financial repayment, but emotional investment in their relationship. "That sounds wonderful, but I insist on paying my own way. Use your money to rebuild your savings account." "Are you sure?" "Michael, I want to travel with you because you want me there. Not because you feel obligated to include me." The cruise was booked for September, giving them 5 months to plan and anticipate. For the first time in years, Margaret had a family vacation to look forward to, one where she was a wanted participant, rather than a tolerated burden. Summer passed quickly. Margaret took a weekend trip to Charleston with her travel club, delighting in the freedom to explore historic mansions and gardens at her own pace. She also spent time with Tommy, taking him to museums and parks, teaching him to bake cookies, reading him stories about different countries and cultures. "Grandma, when you go on the big boat, will you take pictures of the green lights?" Tommy asked one afternoon as they worked together in her small garden. "They're called the Aurora Borealis, and yes, I'll take lots of pictures. Maybe you'll see them yourself someday. Can I come with you on your next trip?" Margaret looked at her grandson's earnest face and felt a rush of love. "When you're older, if your parents say it's okay, I would love to travel with you." "Where would we go?" "Anywhere you want. The whole world is out there waiting for us." The September cruise exceeded all of Margaret's expectations. The ship was elegant but comfortable, and their adjoining cabins gave the family time together, while also allowing for privacy when needed. Michael and Emma had clearly made an effort to choose activities that would appeal to Margaret, and she appreciated their thoughtfulness. But the real magic happened on the third night, when they were anchored in a Norwegian fjord, and the Aurora Borealis appeared in the sky above them. Green and purple lights danced across the darkness, shimmering and flowing like celestial silk scarves. Tommy was entranced, asking endless questions about the science behind the phenomenon, while Margaret simply stood at the ship's rail and marveled at the beauty. "It's incredible," Emma whispered, standing beside her with tears in her eyes. "I can't believe we almost missed this by being too focused on our own little world." Michael joined them, putting an arm around both women. "Mom, thank you for pushing us to see beyond ourselves. This trip, this experience, we never would have had it if you hadn't shown us what we were missing." Margaret leaned into her son's embrace, feeling truly content for the first time in years. "We make a good team when we remember to include each other." The rest of the cruise was filled with shared adventures. They hiked through Icelandic valleys, watched geysers erupt, and soaked in natural hot springs. Tommy collected rocks and postcards, while the adults sampled local foods and learned about Viking history. Margaret found herself in the role of family photographer, capturing moments of joy and discovery that would become treasured memories. On the final night of the cruise, as they sat in the ship's lounge watching the sunset over the North Atlantic, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her lonely evening 18 months earlier, staring at photos of the Bahamas vacation she hadn't been invited to join. "I have an announcement," she said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. "I've booked my next solo adventure." Michael and Emma exchanged glances, but their expressions showed interest rather than concern. "Where are you going this time?" Emma asked. "Vietnam and Cambodia. 3 weeks in February. I want to see Angkor Wat and learn about Southeast Asian culture." "That sounds incredible," Michael said. "Will Walter be joining you?" Margaret smiled. "Actually, yes. And Betty from my Egypt trip and 2 other people from our travel club. We're becoming quite the adventurous group." "I think that's fantastic," Emma said genuinely. "You've inspired me to be more adventurous too. I've been looking into photography classes, and Michael and I are planning a weekend hiking trip while you're away. And I'm going to learn about Cambodia for when you come back," Tommy announced solemnly. "So I can ask you good questions about your trip." Margaret laughed, remembering her 5-year-old grandson's serious approach to learning about Egypt. "I'll bring you back something special." Later that evening, as Margaret unpacked in her apartment surrounded by cruise souvenirs and photos, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. It hadn't been easy confronting her family about their treatment of her, demanding respect, setting boundaries. But it had been necessary. The woman who had booked that first trip to Egypt in a moment of desperate defiance was still inside her, but she was no longer desperate. She was confident, valued, and loved. Not just as someone's mother or grandmother, but as Margaret, a person worthy of respect and inclusion in her own right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Walter. "Saw the Northern Lights photos on your social media. Looks like an amazing trip. Can't wait to hear about it when we meet up in Vietnam." Margaret smiled as she typed back. "Family adventures are wonderful, but I'm looking forward to our next solo adventure too. The world is full of possibilities." And it was. At 67, Margaret had learned that life didn't end when your children grew up, or when your spouse died, or when society tried to convince you that adventure was for younger people. Life could begin again at any age, as long as you had the courage to claim it. She pulled out the silver bracelet she had bought in Egypt, the one with the hieroglyphics that the shopkeeper had said represented strength and independence. As she fastened it around her wrist, Margaret made a promise to herself. She would never again disappear into someone else's life, no matter how much she loved them. Love, she had learned, didn't require self-erasure. In fact, the truest love, the kind that lasted and grew and enriched everyone it touched, required each person to remain whole, to bring their complete self to the relationship. Margaret was whole now, and her family was better for it. They had all learned something valuable about respect, inclusion, and the importance of seeing each other as complete human beings rather than just the roles they played. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret looked at the calendar on her wall where she had marked her upcoming Vietnam trip in red ink. Beside it, she had written the family's Christmas plans and Tommy's spring break visit. Her life now contained both solo adventures that fed her soul and family experiences that connected her to the people she loved most. It was, she thought with deep satisfaction, exactly the balance she had been seeking all along.